She thought it was just a joke. Fix this engine, and I'll marry you. But when the janitor calmly exposed her weakness in front of investors, the entire office culture began to shift. The conference room at the top floor of the Burnham Center in downtown Chicago was packed tight. Suits lined the polished oak table, coffee cups still steaming, laptops glowing faint blue light. It was the quarterly strategy meeting, the kind that could make or break a company's momentum. The atmosphere was tense, but for Victoria Halstead, the 46-year-old CEO, it was just another stage where she expected to shine. She had built a reputation on sharp wit and sharper ambition. But not everything was running smoothly that morning. The presentation system had gone down minutes before investors dialed in. The projector screen sat black, wires tangled beneath the table, and a group of board members fidgeted impatiently. Victoria's patience was already thin. She tapped her pen against the table, scanning the room like a director waiting for understudies to get in line. That's when the door opened. Darnell Cooper, the janitor who had worked in the building for nearly 2 decades, stepped inside. He wore his usual Navy uniform, sleeves rolled up slightly, carrying a small tool bag that clinked faintly as he moved. Darnell wasn't invited to these meetings. He was usually invisible in moments like this. But the leaking vent above the conference table had demanded his attention, and he was used to fixing things without anyone noticing. Victoria, irritated, saw an opportunity to break the tension and win a laugh. With a smirk curling on her lips, she raised her voice for the whole room to hear. "Tell you what, Darnell, fix this engine of a company and maybe I'll marry you." A few chuckles broke out around the table. One director covered his mouth, another snickered uncomfortably, while some glanced at their laptops, unsure whether to laugh or wince. Victoria leaned back in her chair, clearly amused at her own remark. Darnell paused, looking up from his tool bag. He didn't answer right away. His eyes, steady and calm, swept the room. The silence that followed was heavier than Victoria expected. Finally, he said, his tone even, "I'll take a look at the system, ma'am. Might be simpler than you think." No one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the vent above, leaking faintly onto the table. Darnell set his bag down, crouched near the projector's wiring, and got to work. Fingers practiced, movements deliberate, he pulled apart the tangled cords with the ease of someone who had seen this kind of mess countless times before. "What's he doing?" one board member whispered. "Looks like he knows more about this than IT," another muttered. In less than 5 minutes, Darnell located the issue, a faulty connector buried under the table's panel. He adjusted it, tightened the wiring, and tapped the power button. The projector flickered, then roared back to life with a sharp burst of light across the screen. Gasps, then stunned murmurs filled the room. Darnell wiped his hands with a small rag he carried, then spoke again, not looking at Victoria but addressing the group. "Connector was loose. You'll want to check this panel every few weeks or it'll give you the same trouble. I can leave a note for IT." The boardroom fell silent. A few of the investors actually smiled with relief as the presentation slides popped back into place. For them, the day was saved by the man who wasn't supposed to be in the room. Victoria's smirk faltered. She hadn't expected him to fix it, not in front of everyone. What was supposed to be a throwaway line had turned into a spotlight on the very person she had mocked. One executive leaned toward another and whispered, "Did you see that? He just solved it." The tension was no longer about the broken projector. It was about the broken respect in the room, and everyone felt it. Darnell stood, picked up his bag, and looked toward Victoria. There was no anger in his expression, no gloating, just a quiet steadiness. "Anything else you need me to handle before I go?" he asked. For once, Victoria didn't have a clever line ready. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, adjusting her glasses instead. The laugh she had chased now weighed like an anchor in her chest. Darnell gave a small nod to the room and walked out. The boardroom door clicked shut, leaving behind an awkward silence that no amount of coffee could break. The meeting was supposed to be about quarterly numbers, expansion plans, and logistics strategy. But from that moment, everyone in the room knew the real story of the day had already happened. But what they didn't realize yet was that this small exchange would ripple far beyond that conference room, shifting power, respect, and even the future of the company itself. Victoria Halstead's journey to the top was not accidental. She was the kind of leader who thrived on pressure, who measured her worth in numbers on a spreadsheet and the deference of those around her. At 46, she had spent nearly 2 decades carving her way into executive roles, often being the only woman in rooms filled with men twice her age. By the time she took the CEO position at Halstead Logistics, a mid-sized firm based out of downtown Chicago, she had already developed a reputation for being razor-sharp, and at times razor-cold. Colleagues described her as brilliant but intimidating. Investors appreciated her ability to turn stagnant accounts into profitable ventures, but employees whispered about her sharp tongue and dismissive jokes. To Victoria, being in charge meant being untouchable. Respect was not something she gave easily. It was something she demanded. That morning, when the projector failed and Darnell walked in, the joke she made wasn't out of character. She had always used humor, often at someone else's expense, to reassert control when things slipped out of her hands. Darnell Cooper, on the other hand, lived in a different world entirely. At 52, he had spent much of his life working with his hands. He grew up in Gary, Indiana, in a family that valued hard work over titles. His father was a mechanic who fixed engines in their driveway, and his mother worked long shifts at a local diner. From a young age, Darnell learned the value of patience, precision, and humility. After high school, he served in the Army for a few years, where he picked up technical training and an instinct for problem-solving under pressure. When he returned home, he never sought a corner office or a spotlight. Instead, he found steady work as a janitor, eventually joining the staff at the Burnham Center. To many, it seemed like a modest life, but for Darnell, stability meant more than prestige. He was known by security guards, receptionists, and maintenance crews as the man who could fix almost anything: a leaking pipe, a broken chair, a temperamental projector. Quiet competence became his trademark. And yet, despite 2 decades of loyal service, Darnell was invisible to the executives. They passed him daily in the lobby, sometimes offering a nod or a polite morning, but never pausing to know his name or his story. To them, he was simply part of the background. That invisibility was both a shield and a weight. He didn't mind being overlooked, but every so often, a moment like Victoria's careless remark reminded him just how deep the divide was between the suits upstairs and the workers who kept the building running. That divide was sharper than usual on the day of the quarterly meeting. The stakes were high. Investors were dialing in from Los Angeles, Dallas, and Phoenix. The company had recently struggled with shipping delays, losing ground to competitors. And this meeting was Victoria's chance to reassure the board that her leadership could still deliver. Everything, her reputation, her credibility, her authority, was hanging on the smoothness of the presentation. So when the system failed, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a threat. Victoria couldn't afford cracks in her image, and Darnell's unexpected presence gave her the perfect outlet to release that tension. One joke, one quip, one line to remind everyone in the room that she still controlled the stage. But instead of cementing her power, the moment backfired. Because unlike the executives who sat frozen with their laptops, Darnell didn't laugh nervously or back away. He acted. His training, his experience, and his quiet confidence spoke louder than Victoria's sarcasm ever could. And the boardroom noticed. For some, this was the first time they had really looked at him. They saw not just a janitor, but a man who knew his craft and carried himself with dignity. They realized how quickly he had solved a problem that none of them, not even the IT department on call, could handle in real time. In that moment, the contrast between them was unavoidable. Victoria, polished and powerful, had mocked him in front of an audience. Darnell, overlooked and underestimated, had responded with skill and grace. One was chasing control, the other simply did what needed to be done. Back in the hallway after the incident, Darnell returned to his routine. He signed off a maintenance slip, greeted the receptionist by name, and checked the schedule for the rest of the day. For him, it was just another problem solved. But inside that boardroom, the executives were still replaying what they had seen. Some whispered to one another, others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, all aware that something had shifted. Victoria, though, sat rigid in her chair, refusing to show it. She moved on to her slides as if nothing had happened, clicking through graphs and bullet points. But deep down, she felt the sting. She had spent years commanding rooms like this one, yet for the first time in her career, the person who left the strongest impression wasn't her. But the story wasn't finished. Because what had just happened was only the beginning of a power shift that no one in that building had anticipated. The projector was finally alive again, humming with light as slides flickered onto the wall. The graphs were sharp, the bullet points perfectly aligned, and the company's quarterly results glowed in front of everyone. On paper, this was the moment Victoria Halstead had been preparing for all week. Yet instead of relief, she felt something gnawing at her. It wasn't the data. It wasn't the investors. It was the silence that had filled the room just minutes before, when Darnell had fixed what she could not. She adjusted her blazer, forced her voice to remain steady, and began. As you can see, Halstead Logistics has continued to maintain competitive market share despite recent industry setbacks. Her words rang out clearly, but she could sense the lack of focus in the room. A few directors scribbled notes, others kept their eyes on the slides, but the energy had shifted. Victoria knew how to read a room, and this one was restless. At the far end of the table, John Ellery, a grey-haired board member from Dallas, leaned toward his colleague, whispering just loud enough for Victoria to catch fragments. Impressive man, handled himself well. She tightened her grip on the clicker. Normally, comments from board members fueled her confidence, but this time, she wasn't the subject of their admiration. The meeting moved forward, but like a splinter under the skin, the incident lingered. The quarterly numbers told a story of minor growth, tempered by increasing competition from larger firms like XPO and C.H. Robinson. Victoria framed every slide with confident language, highlighting strategic improvements and cost-cutting measures. But the investors weren't asking their usual sharp questions. They seemed distracted, as if the morning had already delivered its most striking moment. Halfway through her presentation, the projector flickered again. Just a hiccup. But it drew a nervous chuckle from the table. All eyes darted toward the door, half expecting Darnell to reappear with his tool bag. The reaction stung Victoria. She cleared her throat and pushed on, refusing to let her annoyance show. Across the table, Daniel Ruiz, a younger director from Phoenix, finally spoke up. Victoria, I want to circle back to your operational strategy. You mentioned cost savings, but what about efficiency improvements in facilities? Maintenance, for example. Seems like there might be vulnerabilities there. The question was pointed, but his tone wasn't hostile. Still, Victoria bristled. She knew exactly why he had raised it. We have a facilities contract that handles those issues, she replied briskly. Today's glitch was an isolated incident, nothing more. Ruiz didn't press, but his raised eyebrows said enough. A few others exchanged looks. The subtle shift was undeniable. A maintenance worker had just shown more reliability than the systems she had in place. Meanwhile, in the hallway just outside the conference room, Darnell quietly signed off the maintenance log. He wasn't eavesdropping, but he could hear faint fragments of the meeting through the thick wooden door. The laughter, the whispers, the long silences. He recognized them. He had seen enough boardrooms over the years, cleaning late at night, to know how quickly power could change hands in those walls. Back inside, Victoria pushed toward the conclusion of her report. She spoke about expanding routes into the Midwest, investing in fleet technology, and optimizing supply chains. Her words were polished, her delivery crisp. Yet the spark wasn't there. The incident had changed the atmosphere. Every point she made, every confident slide she advanced, was weighed against the quiet memory of a janitor kneeling under the table and fixing what a room full of executives could not. By the time she wrapped up, there was polite applause, but not the enthusiastic approval she had anticipated. Investors asked questions, but they were surface level, lacking the kind of energy she relied on to measure success. The board chair, a soft-spoken man named Harold Kent from Minneapolis, cleared his throat. Thank you, Victoria. We'll review the materials in detail and reconvene with follow-up questions. For now, let's take a short recess. Chairs scraped back, conversations broke out in low murmurs, and several board members drifted toward the hallway. A few even passed Darnell as he walked back toward the service elevator, offering small nods of acknowledgement. They weren't nods of dismissal. They were nods of respect. Inside the conference room, Victoria sat frozen for a moment. She had delivered her numbers, but her victory felt hollow. The laughter from her joke had turned into whispers she couldn't control. She had wanted to prove her dominance in front of the investors, but instead, the strongest memory they carried might be of the man she had mocked. But the real turning point wasn't the presentation itself. It was the quiet storm brewing in conversations outside the room, where Darnell's name began to circulate in ways Victoria never expected. The conference room emptied slowly, like a theater after a show where no one was sure if the ending had landed. Executives stretched their legs, checked their phones, and drifted toward the coffee station in the lobby. Yet the usual chatter after a quarterly meeting was muted. People weren't dissecting numbers or debating market share. They were whispering about a single moment. Victoria Halstead, still seated at the head of the table, scrolled through her notes with a look of forced concentration. She knew what they were saying. She had seen it in their faces when Darnell walked out of the room. Her attempt at humor had backfired, and now it was hanging in the air like smoke no one could ignore. Near the coffee station, two junior directors stood side by side. "Did you hear her?" one asked, lowering his voice. "Fix this engine and I'll marry you." I couldn't believe she said that in front of everyone. "Yeah, but the way he handled it." The other shook his head. "Man didn't flinch. Just fixed it and moved on. That's what stuck with me." They weren't the only ones. In the hallway, John Ellery leaned against the wall, sipping from his cup, his expression thoughtful. He had been on the board long enough to see powerful leaders undone by small mistakes. He turned to Daniel Ruiz, who had joined him. "You know, Daniel, I've been on calls with billion-dollar clients who panicked over less. But that janitor, what's his name?" "Darnell, I think," Daniel said. Darnell. He had more composure than most executives I've met. Inside the room, Victoria rose at last, straightening her blazer. She forced a confident smile as she walked into the hallway, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She greeted Ellery and Ruiz with a quick nod. "Gentlemen, thank you for your time today." I trust the numbers were clear. Ellery glanced at her, polite but cool. They were clear enough, but I'll admit, what stood out most wasn't the numbers. Victoria froze for half a beat, then laughed lightly, as if brushing aside the tension. "You mean my little joke?" "Don't worry, I tease everyone." Keeps the energy up in the room, but Ruiz didn't smile. "Sometimes the room doesn't hear it as a joke," he said, "especially when the one being joked about ends up saving the day." The comment landed like a dart. Victoria's smile tightened, but she said nothing, excusing herself toward her office instead. Meanwhile, down in the lobby, Darnell placed his tool bag on a cart and began refilling his cleaning supplies. The morning rush had settled, and the receptionist, a friendly woman named Gloria Ramirez, looked up from her desk. "Heard you fixed the big boss's meeting," she said with a grin. "Just a loose connector," Darnell replied. "That's not what I heard." "People are talking about it like you patched the Titanic." Darnell chuckled softly, but didn't add more. He'd lived long enough to know that attention could be a double-edged sword. Still, there was something different about the way people were looking at him now. Respect, maybe. Or curiosity. Back upstairs, Victoria shut her office door and let out a sharp exhale. For years, she had mastered the art of keeping the upper hand in every conversation. But today, with a single remark, she had slipped. And worse, the man she had aimed her joke at had turned it into a moment of quiet triumph. She replayed it in her head. The smirk, the laughter, the silence that followed. She remembered the way Darnell had looked at her. Not angry, not humiliated, just steady. That look unnerved her more than if he had snapped back. It was the look of someone who knew his worth, even if others didn't. In the cafeteria later that afternoon, the whispers grew louder. Employees gathered in small clusters, sharing second-hand versions of what had happened. She said what? And then, he fixed it? Right there in the meeting. In front of the board? Stories spread fast in office buildings, and this one had all the makings of a legend. The CEO mocked the janitor, and the janitor outshined her. By the end of the day, nearly everyone on the executive floors had heard about it. Some laughed, others frowned, but no one dismissed it entirely. For Victoria, this was dangerous. Her leadership relied on the perception of control. Once people started questioning that, cracks could widen. She needed to regain her footing quickly. But deep down, she knew the damage was already done. As for Darnell, he returned home to his modest apartment in Gary that evening, greeted by the familiar smell of dinner cooking on the stove. His sister Charlene, who lived with him, teased him as he walked in. "You're late?" What broke this time? "Projector," he said, setting down his bag. "Figures. Bet you saved somebody's hide again." Darnell smiled faintly, but didn't mention the joke or the awkward silence that followed. He wasn't interested in reliving it. Yet, in the back of his mind, he wondered how long that moment would linger in the halls of Halstead Logistics. But what neither he nor Victoria fully realized yet was that this single comment, meant as a throwaway line, was about to snowball into something much bigger, a test of pride, humility, and the weight of respect in a place built on power. The next morning, the atmosphere inside Halstead Logistics was different. The building always had its rhythms, the clack of shoes on marble, the low chatter near the elevators, the occasional ring of a desk phone. But this morning, eyes seemed to follow Darnell more than usual. He pushed his cart down the hallway with the same steady pace he always had. But now, instead of being invisible, he felt people noticing. Two analysts in crisp white shirts paused their conversation when he passed. One offered a quick, "Good morning, Mr. Cooper." He almost laughed. Mr. Cooper. In 2 decades, he could count on one hand the times anyone upstairs had called him that. Meanwhile, upstairs in her office, Victoria Halstead was trying to wrestle back control. She sat at her desk, staring at her calendar, replaying the scene again and again in her head. She hated that the moment had escaped her grip. The joke was supposed to make her look clever, but instead, it had exposed something she couldn't admit, that she underestimated someone she should have respected. And worse, others had noticed. When the board chair, Harold Kent, stopped by her office that morning, she braced herself. He rarely visited unannounced. "Victoria," he said evenly, "the presentation went well enough yesterday. But I'd suggest being more mindful in how you phrase things." She forced a smile. "It was just light-hearted banter." "Maybe so," Harold replied. "But perception matters. And the perception yesterday was that someone you dismissed ended up saving the day." Victoria's smile faltered. Harold didn't linger. He left her with that thought, closing the door behind him. Down in the maintenance wing, Darnell sat at a small desk, updating the day's log sheets. Gloria Ramirez from reception poked her head in. "You've got fans?" she teased. "Fans?" Darnell raised an eyebrow. "Couple of execs came by the desk asking your name this morning. One even asked how long you've been here. Looks like you made an impression." Darnell shook his head, scribbling notes into the log. "Wasn't trying to make an impression. Just fixed what needed fixing." Later that afternoon, word came down that the projector was acting up again. This time, the IT department tried handling it, but when their efforts failed, someone suggested calling Darnell. Normally he would have been summoned quietly, like a background player, but this time the request traveled fast, and soon enough he was asked to come up to the executive floor. When he walked in, several pairs of eyes followed him. A few smiled. Someone muttered, "Here comes the guy who saved the meeting." Victoria was there too, leaning against the table, her arms crossed. She didn't say anything, but her expression was tight. Darnell knelt by the projector again, careful with his tools. As he worked, a few executives lingered nearby, almost fascinated by the simplicity of his calm. After a few minutes, he found the problem. A frayed cord behind the panel. "Needs replacing?" he said matter-of-factly. "You keep patching this, it'll keep giving out. I'll order a new one through maintenance. Shouldn't take long." One of the directors chuckled. "Sounds like you should be running facilities." The comment drew a ripple of laughter, but this time it wasn't mocking. It was admiration. Darnell finished the adjustment, and the projector whirred back into action. Victoria finally spoke, her tone clipped. "Thank you, Darnell." He looked up at her. "Just doing my job, ma'am." There was no bite in his voice, no sarcasm, just the quiet professionalism that had carried him all these years, and somehow that made it sting even more for her. The next few days, the story spread further. Employees who had never noticed Darnell before began greeting him by name. One intern even stopped him in the hallway. "You really fixed the CEO's meeting? That's incredible." Darnell smiled faintly. Not incredible. Just wires and patience. But to the people in that building, it was more than that. It was proof that the man they had walked past 100 times without a second thought carried a skill set and a dignity that deserved acknowledgement. Victoria, meanwhile, found herself on the defensive. At a follow-up call with investors, one of them joked, "If you've got Darnell in the building, maybe you don't need half your IT budget." Everyone laughed, but not her. Each time his name came up, it chipped away at the image she had worked so hard to craft. What was supposed to be a passing quip had turned into a mirror, one she couldn't escape. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the smartest person in the room, at least not in the eyes of those who mattered. But the biggest shift wasn't in the projector, the investors, or even Victoria's pride. It was in how Darnell began to carry himself, as if the building itself had finally remembered he was there. By the following week, something unusual was happening at Halstead Logistics. The company was still juggling shipments, still struggling with its supply chain, still fielding nervous calls from investors. But inside the building, conversations had taken on a new tone. And at the center of it all, unexpectedly, was Darnell Cooper. It began in small ways. A junior manager passing him in the hall said, "Morning, Mr. Cooper," as though he were greeting a department head. An accountant in the break room asked him for advice on a temperamental copy machine, and when Darnell fixed it in seconds, the accountant clapped him on the shoulder as if he were a colleague rather than a janitor. What struck people most wasn't just his technical skill, it was the way he carried himself. Calm, steady, unbothered by the sudden attention. He didn't brag, didn't remind anyone of what had happened in the boardroom. He simply kept doing what he always had, fixing what was broken and leaving things better than he found them. But the executives couldn't stop talking. In a midweek meeting with the board, Daniel Ruiz brought up facilities again. "You know," he said casually, "we could save money and headaches if we gave more autonomy to people who actually know the infrastructure. That man Cooper, he's got more practical knowledge than any contractor I've met." John Ellery agreed. There's value in people who know the bones of a building. He handled himself better under pressure than some executives do. Victoria sat stiff at the head of the table, her pen motionless in her hand. She felt the air shift each time Darnell's name was spoken. She wanted to dismiss it, to remind them he was just a janitor, but she knew how it would sound. The joke she had made was already too fresh. Any attempt to belittle him again would only dig the hole deeper. Instead, she tried to steer the conversation back to numbers. "Gentlemen, we're here to discuss revenue streams and client retention." Facilities are secondary, but Ellery didn't let it go. Secondary until they save a meeting worth millions. The remark landed heavily. Victoria forced herself to smile, but her stomach churned. For years, she had been the one board members quoted, the one investors admired. Now they were holding up Darnell as an example in her presence. In the cafeteria that afternoon, employees swapped stories about him like he was a folk hero. "Did you see him in the meeting?" "Cool as ice. He's been fixing things for years. Just nobody bothered to notice. About time somebody gave him credit." Even people who hadn't been in the boardroom felt like they had. The story had taken on a life of its own, morphing into office legend. And with each retelling, Victoria's role shrank while Darnell's grew. One evening, as Darnell was cleaning a conference room, a young analyst approached. "Mr. Cooper, can I ask you something?" Darnell looked up from the vacuum cord. "Sure. How'd you stay so calm when she said that to you? Most people would have been embarrassed. Or mad." He thought for a moment before answering. "I don't take things personal. You let pride do the talking. you lose sight of the work. I just focused on what needed fixing. The analyst nodded, as though he'd just been handed a lesson worth more than his MBA. Word of that exchange traveled too. And slowly, people began to see Darnell not only as the man who fixed the projector, but as someone with a kind of wisdom their polished leaders often lacked. Victoria noticed the shift most when investors from Los Angeles visited later that month. Over dinner, one of them chuckled. "So, Victoria, is Darnell on the payroll for board meetings now?" Everyone laughed warmly, except her. The remark wasn't cruel, but it carried weight. In their minds, her authority had been punctured, and she hadn't found a way to patch it. Alone in her office that night, she stared out at the Chicago skyline. For years, she had worked to make herself indispensable, the sharpest mind in every room. But respect, she was learning, didn't always come from titles or corner offices. Sometimes it came from the people no one noticed, until they had no choice. For Darnell, life hadn't changed dramatically. He still clocked in early, still fixed leaky faucets and flickering lights. But the way people looked at him had changed. And though he never sought it, the shift in power was undeniable. But the story wasn't about who fixed a projector anymore. It was about who truly commanded respect, and the next confrontation would make that clear. By Friday, the story of what happened in the boardroom had traveled across nearly every department floor of Halstead Logistics. It spread through break rooms, echoed in hushed conversations by the elevators, and even made its way into casual chatter in the cafeteria line. For a company that thrived on numbers and quarterly updates, the most important headline that week had nothing to do with revenue or market share. It was about a janitor who had humbled the CEO. At first, some employees retold the story with disbelief. "You're exaggerating," one payroll clerk said. "Victoria wouldn't say something like that out loud." But then another replied, "I was in the room." She said it clear as day. And he fixed it right in front of her. The disbelief quickly turned into fascination. The retelling grew sharper with each version, until it became office folklore. In the accounting department, 2 employees leaned over their desks, whispering, "I swear, I've worked here 6 years and never once heard anyone say his name. Now half the office is talking about him." Kind of makes you wonder who else we've been overlooking. Meanwhile, in human resources, a small group gathered by the copier. One woman, her voice low, said, "If anyone else had made a joke like that, they'd be sitting in my office for a conversation about respect and professionalism. But since it was her, people just laughed nervously." That comment hung heavy in the room. For years, Victoria had been shielded by her title. Employees tolerated her cutting remarks because challenging her meant risking your career. But now, with the whole building buzzing about her slip, that shield looked weaker. Downstairs, in the maintenance wing, Darnell tried to go about his duties as usual, but the atmosphere followed him. Co-workers from other departments stopped by with small compliments. "Heard you saved the day," one said with a grin. Another added, "We've been saying for years they don't appreciate you enough. Now maybe they'll listen." Darnell brushed off the attention, though. "I just fixed some wires," he would say. But deep down, he recognized that this wasn't about wires anymore. It was about visibility. People who had walked past him 100 times without a second glance now wanted to shake his hand. Even the cafeteria buzzed with the story. As Darnell stood in line for coffee, a younger employee turned and said, "You know, Mr. Cooper, my dad always told me, real respect comes from how you carry yourself when nobody's watching." That's exactly what you did. Darnell nodded politely, though he didn't see himself as a symbol. To him it was simple. The job needed doing, and he had done it. But he couldn't deny that something larger was happening around him. Victoria, meanwhile, was fighting her own battle. She walked the hallways with her head held high, but behind closed doors she could feel the weight pressing in. Her executive assistant mentioned that even interns were quoting Darnell's calm response. "Might be simpler than you think." That single line had become a catchphrase repeated half-jokingly whenever a task seemed too big. And each time it was said, her authority took another small blow. In a private lunch with 2 senior managers, Victoria tried to redirect the narrative. "People are blowing this way out of proportion," she said sharply. "He didn't save the company." He just fixed a piece of equipment. One manager hesitated before replying, "Maybe so," but the way he handled it, people noticed. They respect him. The words stung. Respect was supposed to be her currency. It was what she had built her career on. And yet it was slipping through her fingers, not because of a rival executive, but because of a man who carried a tool bag instead of a briefcase. By the end of the week, the divide in the office was clear. Some employees quietly admired Victoria for her drive and accomplishments, reminding one another that she had kept the company afloat during difficult years. But others, emboldened by the story, began to question whether leadership was only about numbers and titles. Respect, they argued, also came from character. In the break room, two longtime employees summarized the tension perfectly. "Victoria runs the company, sure, but Darnell, he's the one people trust now." The other replied, "Maybe that says more about leadership than any quarterly report ever could." For Darnell, the attention felt temporary, like weather that would eventually pass. But for Victoria, it was a storm she couldn't escape. Every whisper, every retelling of the story, every nod of respect toward him was a reminder that her authority was under quiet siege. But the whispers couldn't stay whispers forever. And soon they would lead to a direct confrontation between Victoria and Darnell that neither of them could avoid. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, one of those long days when the office seemed weighed down by grey skies and endless meetings. Victoria Halstead had just finished a tense call with investors. They wanted reassurance that the company was headed in the right direction, but their questions carried an edge. It wasn't just numbers they were probing anymore. It was confidence. Hers, specifically. She set her phone down, rubbing her temples. For over a week now, the incident with Darnell had followed her like a shadow. Every time she walked into the cafeteria, conversations seemed to hush. Every time she passed through a hallway, she could feel eyes on her, not with admiration, but with quiet judgment. And the worst part? Darnell wasn't even trying. He wasn't bragging, wasn't stirring things up. He was simply there, fixing faucets, repairing lights, carrying his tool bag like nothing had changed. That somehow made it worse. So when she heard his voice in the corridor outside her office, she made a decision. She stepped into the hall. "Mr. Cooper?" she called, her tone sharper than she intended. Darnell paused, holding a clipboard. He turned, polite but unreadable. "Yes, ma'am? Could you come inside for a moment? I'd like to speak with you." He followed her in, closing the door gently behind him. Victoria gestured toward a chair. "Sit." He sat, resting the clipboard on his lap. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were steady, the same calm presence that had unsettled her in the boardroom. Victoria leaned against her desk, arms crossed. "I think we need to clear the air. There's been talk about what happened last week." Darnell didn't interrupt. "You've probably heard it," she continued. "People exaggerating, making it into something bigger than it was. I made a joke, you fixed the projector, and now it's turned into whatever this is." Finally, Darnell spoke, his voice even. "I've heard people talking, yes. But I didn't start it." "I know you didn't," she said quickly. "But perception matters. And right now, the perception is that you embarrassed me. That you showed me up in front of my own board." Darnell tilted his head slightly. "I didn't set out to embarrass you. The system was broken. I fixed it. That's all." Her jaw tightened. "That's not all. Whether you meant to or not, the way it looked, you stepped into a space that wasn't yours, and people are using it against me." He took a slow breath before answering. "With respect, ma'am, I didn't step into your space. You called me out in front of everyone." I responded. "What else was I supposed to do? Stand there while they laughed?" The words hung in the air. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. For once she had no quick retort. Darnell continued, his tone still calm, but edged with quiet conviction. "You've got power in this building, more than anyone else. And with power comes the choice, to use it to lift people up or to tear them down. That day, you chose the second." And maybe folks noticed more than you expected. Victoria's arms dropped to her sides. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to her without fear, without deference. without needing anything from her. It stung, but it also struck something deeper. She turned toward the window, staring at the skyline. Do you have any idea what it takes to sit in this chair? The pressure, the expectations. One mistake, one slip, and people are waiting to pounce. I can't afford to look weak. Darnell rose slowly from his chair. Respect doesn't come from never slipping. It comes from how you treat people when you do. Everyone in this building knows numbers go up and down. What they remember is how you make them feel in the process. He set the clipboard on her desk. That's all I have to say. Victoria turned back, caught off guard by the finality in his tone. For once, she had no authority over the moment. He had said his piece, and there was nothing she could do to spin it. When he left her office, she sank into her chair, her reflection faint in the window glass. She had always thought of respect as something she commanded with power, but for the first time, she wondered if she had been chasing the wrong kind all along. But the real fallout from their confrontation wasn't just about pride. Soon, it would reach the boardroom again, and this time, it wouldn't be about a broken projector. The confrontation between Victoria and Darnell remained behind her office door, but the ripple of its after-effects began surfacing in ways she couldn't control. She returned to her meetings, her polished reports, her late-night emails, yet the air around her seemed different. It wasn't open rebellion, no one dared challenge her authority outright, but something more subtle. Conversations paused when she entered a room. Jokes landed with less laughter. Employees who once scrambled to please her now kept their distance. The board noticed it too. At their next quarterly review session, Harold Kent, the chair, asked bluntly, "Victoria, how's morale across the company?" "We've heard some chatter." She stiffened. "Morale is fine. People get distracted by gossip, but our performance speaks for itself." John Ellery, sipping his coffee, added, "Performance matters, yes. But culture matters too. Investors watch both. What happened last time, it's still on people's minds." The mention stung. She wanted to wave it off, but Ruiz leaned forward. "John's right. When employees start quoting a janitor more than their CEO, you've got a cultural problem." A hush settled over the table. Ruiz hadn't said it cruelly, but the words hit hard. Victoria forced a calm expression. "Mr. Cooper is a capable employee, but this is being blown out of proportion. I'm leading the company through competitive markets, and that should be our focus." But even as she spoke, she could see it in their faces. The seed of doubt had taken root. Meanwhile, Darnell carried on with his quiet routine, but recognition kept following him. An email circulated from a mid-level manager praising his quick thinking. Another department invited him to sit in on a facilities review, just to give input. He hadn't asked for any of this, but suddenly his voice was being sought out in spaces he had never been invited before. In the cafeteria one afternoon, a group of employees gathered around him. "You should have seen the way she froze," one said, recounting the boardroom moment again. Darnell shook his head. "That's not something to celebrate. Embarrassing someone doesn't fix anything." "But you didn't embarrass her," another chimed in. "She did that to herself. All you did was show people who you are." Those words echoed more than he expected. For years he had accepted his invisibility. Now people were holding up his calm as something aspirational. Victoria, on the other hand, was watching her grip loosen. Investors weren't abandoning her yet, but their tone had shifted. They pressed harder in meetings, asked sharper questions, and referenced the culture issue more than once. At a dinner with two potential clients, one made an offhand joke. "If things break down, maybe you should call Darnell." The table laughed politely. She smiled thinly, but inside she felt her authority cracking. Late one evening, she sat alone in her office, staring at the city lights. Her career had been built on never showing weakness, on never letting anyone think she was anything less than in control. But now she faced the unthinkable. Her power wasn't slipping because of market losses or failed strategies. It was slipping because of respect. Respect she had failed to show, and respect someone else had earned without even trying. When Harold Kent requested a private meeting with her later that week, she knew it was serious. He sat across from her, his expression measured. "Victoria," he began, You've done remarkable work for this company. No one doubts your talent. But leadership isn't just numbers. It's how people experience you. And right now, many are questioning that. She bristled. Are you suggesting a janitor is more qualified to lead than I am? Harold didn't flinch. I'm suggesting that respect doesn't trickle down from titles. It rises from character. And right now, his character is what people are talking about. The words landed harder than she expected. For once, she didn't have a rebuttal. Down in the maintenance wing, Darnell ended another long day, setting his tool bag by the door. He never sought recognition, never aimed for power. Yet he could feel the shift around him. People saw him now. They listened. And whether he wanted it or not, his quiet steadiness had become a counterweight to the very culture Victoria had built. But the real lesson hadn't yet been spoken aloud. And when it finally surfaced, it would change the way both of them understood respect, leadership, and the cost of pride. The weeks that followed turned into a slow reckoning. For all the spreadsheets and sales charts that passed across the boardroom table, the moment people remembered most was still the one when Victoria Halstead made her joke, and Darnell Cooper answered with quiet action. No quarterly gain or client win could erase the shift in how employees viewed respect inside the walls of Halstead Logistics. Victoria wrestled with that truth daily. Every time she crossed the lobby, she caught sight of Darnell speaking with someone, a security guard, a young analyst, a mid-level manager, and she saw something in their faces she longed for. Trust. They looked at him with ease, as though they knew he would do right by them, even in small things. With her, it was different. She had their compliance, but not their warmth. One Friday morning, she passed the cafeteria and overheard two employees talking. That man Cooper, he treats everyone the same. Doesn't matter who you are. Yeah, makes you think about what leadership should really look like. The words stung because they rang true. She could keep hiding behind numbers and authority, but she couldn't deny what had been revealed. Leadership was not just about results. It was about humanity. That afternoon, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She called Darnell to her office again. This time, her tone was different when he arrived. Mr. Cooper, I owe you an apology, she said, standing instead of sitting behind her desk. What I said in that meeting was wrong. It was disrespectful, and I realize I put you in a position you didn't ask for. Darnell studied her, his expression calm. Took some courage to say that. I should have said it sooner, she admitted. I've spent so long chasing control that I forgot respect has to be given before it can be received. He nodded, then leaned on the chair in front of him. Respect isn't complicated. People notice how you treat them, especially when you think no one's watching. That's what lasts. For a long moment, the office was quiet. Victoria felt something she hadn't felt in years. Humility. And though it was uncomfortable, it was also liberating. She realized that no title, no salary, no polished report could replace the basic decency of treating others with dignity. In the days that followed, she began making small changes. She greeted people by name, not just the executives, but the interns, the receptionists, the cleaning staff. She invited feedback instead of brushing it off. Slowly, the walls she had built between herself and her employees began to thin. Some still doubted her sincerity, but others noticed the shift. As for Darnell, he continued his routine. He didn't seek the spotlight, but he couldn't avoid the fact that he had become a quiet symbol of integrity in the building. People carried his words like lessons. Respect isn't complicated. In a world where so many chased recognition, his refusal to seek it made him stand out even more. The board, too, took notice. At the next meeting, Harold Kent closed the session with a simple remark. Numbers can tell us where we're going, but culture tells us if we'll survive the trip. Let's not forget that everyone in the room knew exactly what he was referring to. In the end, the incident didn't end Victoria's career, nor did it elevate Darnell into a corner office. What it did was reveal something timeless. True leadership is not about titles, wealth, or sharp wit. It's about character, humility, and the way you treat the people who have the least to give you. For employees across Halstead Logistics, the lesson stuck. They still remembered the day the CEO tried to get a laugh at the janitor's expense, and how he turned the moment into a quiet triumph. And perhaps the most powerful part of the story was this. Darnell never had to raise his voice, never had to demand respect. He simply showed it, and in return, people gave it back. If this story reminded you that respect is worth more than titles, make sure to subscribe for more. Stories like these remind us that power can fade, but character lasts.